Welcome to the Tilted Halo. This is a new podcast, and it's for anybody who's a woman in ministry. You might be a pastor like myself, a bishop, a priest, a rabbi, music minister, elder, children's minister, whatever your title is. You're absolutely in the right place, especially if you're someone who loves your ministry and you're doing it well and you're feeling pressure to sometimes be perfect, and deep down inside, you know you're not. And how in the world to deal with that? And men, you're absolutely welcome here too, because this is about ministry and the same thing can happen to you. So you're all in the right place. Let's get started with the show. Welcome to another episode of The Tilted Halo. It would be nice to think that our journey is smooth, no bumps in the road, no ups and downs. Doesn't happen that way. And I've shared a little bit of my journey in the past, but in case you haven't heard some of it, I started in about 8th grade feeling a pull to want to do something, sense of wanting to do something in ministry, or that's where God was leading me. And there were no female roles available to me that fit me. I mean, there were female roles of being in the kitchen, taking care of the children's Sunday school program, being a church secretary, singing in the choir, those kinds of things. And there was also a role of a great aunt of mine somebody I knew, and early on in my life, who had dedicated her life to working in the church and had never married, but she had ended up being the one of the administrators in what at the time was called an old folks home, now known as a retirement community usually, and an orphanage. Well, we don't have too many orphanages around in the United States anymore, but there are a lot of retirement communities. And she had a very responsible role there. But none of those things seemed to fit for who I was. And it wasn't until I got into college that I learned that women could be pastors. And actually that change in my denomination had happened about 12 months or so before I started college. And that became the road that I was going to travel on. Except when I got into the beginning of my junior year of college, or just before that, a family tradition was you always had an annual physical. So I had gone in for my annual physical, fine. The doctor had said, you're old enough, you should really have a chest x-ray. Great, no problem. Went off to school. And in less than the first week, it was on a weekend, in fact, got a phone call. And it was one of those kinds of phone calls where, you pick up the phone and you know something's wrong. It was my mother who was calling, and the sound of her voice told me something is wrong. But I didn't know what. My first thought was somebody died. Literally, that was my first thought. And I was concerned it might have been my dad. But nobody had died. But something had shown up on that chest x-ray. In fact, what had shown up was an enlargement of the right side of my heart. And so that required some other tests and procedures to figure out why the right side of my heart was abnormally large. Well, I was in the hospital in a couple of weeks having a heart catheterization and an angiogram. And that confirmed the diagnosis that I had a hole inside of my heart where there wasn't supposed to be a hole. Now, my dad, who was very quick to the puns, said I was going into the right profession because I had a holy heart. Unfortunately, that wasn't the kind of holy that I was thinking about at the time. But it still got a chuckle out of me, even in the midst of all of that. But that hole in my heart meant I needed to have surgery. It wasn't an emergency, but I had been told by the cardiologist that if I didn't have surgery sooner rather than a lot later, the chances were probably 100% that I would never live to see my 40th birthday. Maybe not even my 30th. And so it was really quite important that I have the surgery. But it was also decided that since it wasn't an emergency, I could wait and have it after the school year. And the following, it ended up being in June. But that meant there was 9 months between the time I realized I needed the surgery and when I actually had it. 9 months. In those 9 months, I went through a lot. I became really, I don't know if I was clinically depressed, but I was not a happy camper, to say the least. And a lot of that was because the only person I knew at that point in my life who had had any kind of heart surgery was the principal of the high school I had attended. Now, keep this in context, because this was now in the 1970s, early 70s, when this principal had had heart surgery. And so it wasn't the common practice and common kind of surgery that it is today. This man was not just the principal of the high school. He was somebody I knew at least somewhat personally, because he and his family were members of the congregation where my family and I attended church. And they were there quite regularly. So this was somebody, like I said, not just the principal there. And in his 40s, he had had a heart attack. He recuperated from the heart attack. And then after a couple of months in spring of what was my sophomore year of high school, he went in for bypass surgery. He did well through the surgery, but he died of complications within 24 hours. I thought that meant that any kind of heart surgery was likely to lead to death. And I knew enough at that point that bypass surgery worked on the blood vessels on the outside of your heart. But my surgery was going to require that they cut into my heart and work on the inside. And it scared the bloomin' daylights out of me. I thought I was going to die when I had that surgery. And so I began to look at my life. What meaning is there in life when you're staring at death? I mean, let's be real about that. I looked at that and I realized at that point in my life, I had spent 4/5 of the years of my life going to school. And my thought was, what good is all that doing? Why? And why was I in school right then? What use would that be if I was going to be dying in a couple of months? I seriously considered quitting school. I thought about joining the Peace Corps, which was very popular at the time, but realized that they weren't going to want somebody who's got a hole in their heart, going to heaven only knows what country. And so that didn't seem like an option. I was attending a school in the northern part of the United States on the shores of one of the Great Lakes. And in the middle of winter, I can tell you that water gets very cold, cold enough to form ice structures from the wind and the waves along the shoreline. And those ice structures don't melt very quickly. The thought crossed my mind a couple of times at least, how easy it would be to just walk out into that water and never come back. I'm being real here and honest. And I thought about that, but then I also realized the idea of drowning or freezing to death, that really didn't appeal to me. So I thankfully, never did that. But obviously, I was in a pretty depressed state. And what do you do in that? And I began to wonder, why was I feeling a calling from God if I was going to be dying? That didn't make any sense to me. The two things, it's what's called an oxymoron. They just don't fit together. And neither of them was computing in my brain at that point in time. But the beauty was that there were some people in my life who brought a glimmer of hope into me in the midst of all of that. They were kind of like a spark, a tiny candle flame in the midst of that. One of them was my roommate, who took the time to listen, really listen when I needed to talk. Another was the campus pastor, who would ask how I was doing because he knew what was going on. And then there were things in his Sunday sermons, because there was a worship service at that church on campus every single Sunday. There were things in his sermons that got me thinking and hearing about God's love in the midst of all of that. And there were friends who continued to invite me and include me in things, even when I wasn't exactly the most cheerful person. And there was family who would call and check on me and take care, ask how I was doing. But there was also things that I did. I started writing a journal. I had some very long conversations with God, and I wrote things down in a journal at that point in my life. I had some very long conversations with God that I didn't write down, that they were basically prayers, and I was kind of angry with God at times, kind of wondered why, and I asked those questions, and I found out that's okay. God is big enough. God is confident enough, if you want to use that word, in everything about who God is, to take my anger, to take my questions and my challenges. And that's okay. And the reason I knew that is because I had read the book of Psalms. Every human emotion you want is in that book, the book of Psalms. And I figured if the psalmist can say those things and ask God why and all of those kinds of things, I could too. Never once did God tell me, no, don't ask this, don't say that. None of that. That was part of my journey. That was part of me growing, instead of just being a meek person, kind of a milk toasty type of person, to getting grounded, deeply grounded in my faith. Now, obviously, I'm still alive and I'm beyond the age of 40. So I did have that surgery. Everything went fine. But before the surgery, I began to have hope. That's an important ingredient here, to have hope in the midst of the difficulties. All of that was great groundwork, and great and important groundwork. When I was in the position in the 5th year of my second position as a pastor, and was told by the new senior pastor, thank you, but you're leaving. One way or the other, you are leaving. You could either choose to resign or be fired, but you're out of here. If I had, in a sense, not gone through that earlier experience and known that I could share anything with God, literally anything. If I had chosen to use a streak of swear words, that would have been okay. That was not my style, but God's big enough to handle that. It's an absolute conviction I have that God can handle that. And God's not going to strike us dead or strike us down or make life worse because of those kinds of things. If we're angry with God, let God know. And part of that has all been so critical to my growing. It's critical to all of us, to knowing that God can handle anything that we ask, anything that we feel, anything that is troubling us. We can always bring it to God. And doing that is critical for those of us who are in ministry. There's so much that gets thrown at us without any question about it. There are those congregational members who try our patience like we would really rather not have them tried. There are things that happen that throw everything out of whack in ministry and, make us really wonder, what in the world am I doing here? There would be so many other professions or jobs that would be so much easier than this. And there are times when, if you're anything like me, you really would like to quit. I've been there and been through that. The total frustrations of it all, and sometimes just the meanness that people can share with each other and even with you. The conflicts that are there, that's a whole nother episode someday, dealing with the conflicts in a congregation. But in all of that, we need to be absolutely grounded in our faith and to use that as a way to share with other people our own voice, to realize that we can build a whole life. And it's not just limited to the times we're in the ministry, the times we're working in the congregation. Life is more than that. That may seem strange to us sometimes in ministry, but we are more than just the title of our role. We are more than pastor, priest, children's minister, youth minister, whatever that title is. We're more than that. You are a whole person. I am a whole person. And we bear that title, we bear that role, that yoke of responsibility, as sometimes it's called, but we're a whole person. And knowing that, being grounded, know that God loves the whole of us, the questions, the doubts, the uncertainties that we have, the feelings like, I'm not good enough for this, or this whole thing stinks and feels like something you don't want to be a part of anymore. Or, what's God thinking in all of this? Have you ever asked that question? I bet you have. If you're honest, you have in more ways than one. And why are you there? Have you ever asked yourself that question? What in the world did I get myself into? Yeah. Life as a pastor, rabbi, bishop, children's minister, youth minister, it's about those things. But it's more than that, because your life has been more than that. You had everything in your life before that experience, before you bore that title. And someday you will retire. And yes, you may still carry the title, but you will need to find other meaning and purpose and vision for your life beyond that title. One of the hardest things is when a pastor retires and doesn't have anything more for her or him to do, when identity is so wrapped up in that title, pastor, reverend, bishop, I don't care what it is. If your identity is so wrapped up in that title, the time of retirement is going to be extremely difficult. And that's when it can get into a whole lot of trouble, with a congregation, with the next pastor that comes in, with the next person that takes that congregation that you've left when you retired. You need to realize that you are whole. You can have a life that you're excited about in ministry and in more than ministry. There are avenues to explore and grow in. Do you have a hobby? Do you have something you enjoy doing outside of ministry? I sure hope so. One of the things I used to enjoy before my knees started complaining was being in the garden and literally pulling weeds. Yes, pulling weeds. There was something so organic about being in the soil and seeing something happen. I could see progress. I could see what was happening. And sometimes in ministry, we don't see a whole lot of progress. That's truth. So being out there in the garden, I could see progress when I was pulling those weeds. And I could see the flowers blooming, because it was mostly flower gardens that I do. And, I could see that. So you need a hobby. You need things beyond the ministry to have a whole life, to be a whole person. Love your children, your grandchildren. Spend time with them. Enjoy them. And remember, God is big enough to include all of what you feel, all of what you experience, so you can have a voice in the midst of all of it and have a life that you really love, beginning, middle, and end of it. Come back next week. I'm going to have a whole new show. You need to be there. Take care until that time. You have been listening to Tilted Halo with me, Kathleen Panning. What did you think about this episode? I'd really like to hear from you. Leave me some comments. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share this episode. And catch another upcoming episode for more conversation on ministry, life, mindset, and a whole lot more. Go to www.tiltedhalohelp.com, where I've got a resource guide and other resources waiting for you. And be sure to say hi to me, Kathleen Panning, on LinkedIn. See you on the next episode.